The moment I stepped into that courtroom, my daughter Melissa let out a nervous giggle. My son-in-law Gregory just shook his head like I was a pathetic joke. Then the judge looked up. He went white as a sheet. His gavel slipped from his trembling hand as he whispered a name nobody in that room knew: the Scalpel. He was staring right at me. My family thought they were putting a senile old woman in a cage. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a ghost. It started with an insult I was meant to swallow. Sunday dinner, my daughter Melissa and her husband Greg Walsh holding court at their sprawling Los Angeles mansion, talking through me like I was a piece of furniture. Greg bragged about his 9-figure resort deal in Ohio without looking up from his phone. I am Vivian Price, 71 years old, and at that table, I was invisible. 10 years ago, after my husband Edward died, I sold our Connecticut home and bought the guest house on Melissa's property to stay close to her. Only my grandson, Tyler, 16, ever looked at me like I existed. When he invited me to his playoff game, Greg cut him off before I could answer. "Don't bother your grandmother. She needs her rest. She's old," Melissa giggled and agreed. They diagnosed my whole existence without a glance in my direction. I said nothing. I mistook my silence for patience. It was permission. 3 days later, Greg knocked on my door with an expensive bottle of wine I couldn't drink. My cardiologist had banned alcohol after my bypass. It was theater. Greg got to the point fast. He needed a $500,000 bridge loan against my guest house to clear permits on his Ohio deal. 6 months, he promised, and he'd hand back $700,000. I told him no. I was 71, past my risk-taking days, and my money was for my retirement and medical bills. The mask dropped instantly. Cold fury replaced the salesman's smile. "You live here on our land," he snapped. He didn't know, or had conveniently forgotten, that when I bought this guest house, I also bought the 2 acres his mansion sat on. His 99-year lease, $1 a year, was with me. He was living on my land and didn't even know it. He stormed out, hurling a threat behind him. A week later, I woke at 3 a.m. with angina crushing my chest. I called Melissa first. She answered groggy and annoyed, cited her charity gala meeting in the morning, told me to call 911 if it was that bad, and hung up without asking how I felt. I took an Uber to the ER alone. Discharged by 9, I came home to see her white Range Rover parked outside a Beverly Hills spa, not at any gala. They didn't just disrespect me. They saw me as an errand not worth running. The next morning, a courier delivered a legal petition. Gregory and Melissa Walsh, petitioners. Vivian Price, respondent. They were filing for emergency conservatorship, claiming I was mentally incapacitated, senile, delusional, incapable of managing my own affairs. Attached was a diagnostic report from a doctor, Peter Lim, describing dementia and paranoid delusions. I had never met anyone named Peter Lim in my life. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the main house, papers in hand, and found them poolside, relaxed, waiting like predators who'd already set their trap. Melissa flinched at the sight of the envelope. Greg tried concerned son-in-law theater. "We were hoping you wouldn't see it like this," twisting my heart scare into proof of my incompetence. When I pushed back, his mask fully came off. "See you in court, old woman," he sneered. "Go find yourself a public defender." That was the moment the invisible old woman they thought they knew died. And something else woke up. Behind a false wall in my closet was a room they never knew existed. A biometric lock, 3 monitors, file cabinets, an encrypted satellite line. Greg thought I'd been some mid-level bookkeeper. He had no idea that 30 years ago in Washington, D.C., I was the Department of Justice's lead forensic investigator. CEOs, senators, corrupt executives. They called me the Scalpel. I sent 12 high-profile executives to prison with a single spreadsheet before I buried that woman to care for Edward through his illness, and then to become an invisible grandmother. Today, Greg and my daughter had just given the Scalpel a reason to come back. I called Avery Hayes, an old contact. Her father had worked cases with me decades ago. She arrived the next morning. No flash, just a slim briefcase and eyes like cold steel. I handed her the petition. Within an hour, she called back. Dr. Peter Lim wasn't a psychologist, psychiatrist, or neurologist. He was a dentist, license permanently revoked 5 years earlier for insurance fraud and running an illegal opioid pill mill. That answered what? It didn't answer how a real estate developer found a disgraced dentist in a strip mall clinic. So I dug. When Lim was arrested, his $100,000 bail was covered by a bondsman guaranteed by a shell company, Walsh Holdings GP. Greg hadn't found Dr. Lim last week. He'd owned him for 5 years. A compromised asset kept on a leash, waiting for the day he'd need a doctor's signature. This wasn't impulsive greed. It was a 5-year-old contingency plan. I turned to the money. Greg had layered his companies through Delaware shells, but he'd made one lazy mistake. Every filing used the same old personal email address. Following that thread through old financial databases, I found a private data room with Citadel Apex Capital, a vulture private equity fund. The logs told the real story. Greg's Golden Resort was $50 million over budget, buried in contractor liens, his liquidity reports faked. A week earlier, the day after I refused his loan, Citadel Apex had issued an emergency capital call. $5 million in 10 business days, or they'd trigger cross-collateralization and seize everything he owned. He hadn't needed my $500,000 as an investment. He'd needed it as a stopgap payment to hold off the wolves. When I said no, he activated the backup plan he'd been sitting on for years. He wasn't trying to steal my modest retirement. He needed to liquidate my entire estate to save himself. But a lawsuit like this costs money too. Lawyers, a bribed expert. Where did a bankrupt man find cash? My mind went to Melissa's foundation. After Edward died, I'd put several $1 million into the Isabel Price Foundation for Cancer Research and made Melissa its managing director, trusting her completely. I called the bank managing its assets and invoked my founder's rights. The statement arrived in minutes. What should have held over $3 million now held $412,000. Buried in the transfers. $150,000 to Walsh Holdings for consulting, $80,000 to a shell company Greg owned for gala planning. And on every check, the signature authorizing the transfer wasn't Greg's. It was Melissa's. She wasn't a manipulated bystander. She was an active partner, looting her own mother's memorial fund to bankroll the lawsuit meant to have me declared insane. In that moment, my daughter stopped being a victim in this story. She became the enemy. I called Avery back with new instructions. We weren't playing defense anymore. I needed the name of Greg's lender. Citadel Apex Capital, she said, a fund known for liquidating, not negotiating. I knew that name. 30 years ago, a young trader named Jim Callahan had been wrongly targeted in a fraud case I investigated. I found the evidence that cleared him instead of burying him. He built Citadel Apex from nothing afterward and told me once, if I ever needed anything, just call. I called. I asked him to sell me Greg's debt outright. All $5 million of it. No paper trail, a blind trust wire transfer. Within the hour, Citadel Apex no longer held Greg's note. I did. I told Avery to draft the seizure paperwork, but hold it. We wouldn't warn him. We'd walk into the conservatorship hearing and hand it to him in front of the judge. I dressed for war. A charcoal suit I hadn't worn since testifying before the Senate Banking Committee. Melissa giggled when she saw me. Greg smirked, dismissing it as a dying woman's last performance. The judge called the case. He looked up to identify the respondent and froze. His pen clattered to the desk. Leaning into the microphone, he whispered, "My God, is that really her?" Every head turned to me. He was John Carmichael, once a young, drowning assistant U.S. attorney on the Enright fraud case 30 years earlier. I was the expert witness who'd handed him the case that built his career. He turned to Greg's lawyer with a warning. "That is the scalpel. Good luck. You're going to need it." Their star witness, Dr. Lim, took the stand and delivered his rehearsed diagnosis: cognitive decline, paranoid delusions, incapable of managing her affairs. Avery rose with a single sheet of paper. Within minutes, she'd forced him to admit under oath that he wasn't a licensed psychologist at all. He was a dentist, license revoked for fraud and running a pill mill. Then she produced the bank record, a $25,000 wire from Walsh Holdings GP to Peter Lim 3 days before he signed the fraudulent diagnosis. The judge had Lim arrested for perjury on the spot. Cornered, Greg insisted on testifying himself, painting himself as a concerned son-in-law. Avery dismantled him piece by piece, walked him into admitting he'd asked a supposedly incompetent old woman for $500,000 as a golden opportunity, then forced him to confirm under oath that his Ohio project was $50 million over budget and in default on a $5 million capital call. Cornered further, she asked where he'd found the cash to bribe Lim and hire lawyers while broke. He had no answer. She gave one, the Isabel Price Foundation. Melissa broke down, realizing the administrative fees she'd approved were theft from her own mother's charity. Greg finally shattered completely, screaming that it was all my fault, that I should have just written the check. Judge Carmichael slammed his gavel for order, then turned to me and asked if I had anything to say in my own defense. I stood. I told him I hadn't come to defend my sanity. I'd come to file a criminal complaint. I laid out Greg's embezzlement, and then turned to my daughter and named her role. The signature on every check was hers. She wept, protesting she hadn't known. I told her plainly. She signed them. Greg, desperate, sneered that I had nothing, that I was a broke old woman in a guest house. I let the silence sit. Then I nodded to Avery. She crossed the aisle and placed a thick document in front of him, an emergency notice of foreclosure and seizure. His lender had sold his defaulted $5 million debt. I was the buyer. He hadn't defaulted on Citadel Apex anymore. He defaulted on me. The mansion, the cars, Walsh Holdings, everything he thought was his now belonged to me. The conservatorship hearing was over. The eviction hearing was just beginning. After that, it wasn't a trial. It was a sentencing. The evidence, foundation transfers, fraudulent invoices, suborned perjury, bank fraud on the Ohio project, was airtight. Greg fought, tried to paint himself as manipulated, refused every plea deal out of arrogance. The jury took less than an hour to convict him on 12 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement. 10 years in state prison. Melissa's lawyer begged me to write a letter asking for leniency to say Greg had controlled her. I refused. She was a grown woman who'd made her own choice, and I would not shield her from consequences I'd spent 10 years letting her live without. She took a plea. Guilty to felony misuse of charitable funds, 3 years probation, full restitution of the $230,000, and 2,000 hours of community service assigned to the locked dementia ward of a nursing home, bathing and feeding people who'd truly lost their minds. The very thing she'd tried to falsely brand me as. 6 months later, the mansion was gone, sold at auction. I sold the guest house, too. Half the proceeds rebuilt the Isabel Price Foundation under new management. The other half went into a trust for Tyler, locked until he turns 25. I was packing the last boxes in my empty hidden office when Melissa appeared at the door, hollowed out in a faded volunteer smock, years older than 6 months should have made her. She asked why I'd let it go so far, why I hadn't just stopped them before it became this. I told her if I had stopped her, she'd have learned nothing. She'd have hated me for a week and gone right back to him. I reminded her of the $50 she stole from her mother's purse at 10 years old, how Edward's mother had forgiven her instantly and quietly replaced the money herself, and how Melissa never paid for that theft. She just kept stealing bigger things. I told her the books had to balance eventually. I handed her an envelope, an address for a small apartment, 3 months paid, a bus pass, and told her after that she was on her own. She left. I watched her go. I'm 71 years old. I've retired twice. Once from my career, once from being the silent, accommodating old woman they thought I was. That day in court, I picked the pen back up. I learned that silence isn't patience. It's permission, if you let it run long enough. Real strength isn't in how loud you shout. It's in knowing exactly when to move and having the discipline to wait for that moment. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the books to balance. And finally, they do. If this story hit home, drop your city or state in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more real stories like this every week. Until next time, the ones who count you out are usually the ones who never bothered to find out who they were counting.